There's one other thing in today's news that I think, that I also want to get some expert help about. But this one is one where I'm not sure if it should make us all feel more rattled or more calm. And this is something that we have covered on and off over the past couple of years, really, on this show. The basic story here is one that we started to hear about back during the start of the 2016 presidential campaign. In December of 2015, right before Christmas that year, there was a huge power blackout in the nation of Ukraine. It was Christmas time, it was freezing cold in Ukraine. Hundreds of thousands of people lost power entirely without any warning. U.S. government investigators soon assessed that that power outage in Ukraine, quote, may well have been the first power blackout triggered by a cyber attack. Ukrainian officials were already claiming at that time, and the U.S. government's assessment would soon back them up, that it was actually a Russian cyber attack that caused that blackout. Russia hacked into control systems for the Ukrainian power grid and shut the lights off in that country at will, right before Christmas 2015, basically as a way to punish that country and scare its leaders. In December of 2016, senior Obama administration officials raised the alarm that Russian government hackers were also targeting critical infrastructure, including power grid infrastructure, in the United States, just as they had done when they shut off the lights in Ukraine the year before. By the following summer, in July of 2017, the New York Times had obtained a copy of an urgent joint report that had just been issued by the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security, warning that, quote, hackers have been penetrating the computer networks of companies that operate nuclear power stations and other energy facilities, as well as manufacturing plants in the United States. The urgent joint report issued by Homeland Security and the FBI carried an urgent amber warning, the second highest rating for the sensitivity of the threat. Then it was a few months later, in March 2018, the Homeland Security Department and the FBI issued publicly a joint technical alert. Quote, this alert provides information on Russian government actions targeting U.S. government entities, as well as organizations in the energy, nuclear, commercial facilities, water, aviation, and critical manufacturing sectors. Quote, contact DHS or law enforcement immediately to report an intrusion and to request incident response resources or technical assistance. The first warning from DHS and FBI that had been reported on by the New York Times was not a public warning. That second one, that technical bulletin, was effectively a public warning, although it was full of technical information, including specific malware, specific computer code lines that they wanted operators of those critical elements of U.S. infrastructure to look for in their computer systems. So by that point, by March of last year, the threat and the warnings from the U.S. government were getting more specific, both in terms of the potential damage that could be caused by these type of cyber attacks and the specificity with which the U.S. government was identifying the perpetrators. Quote, cyber attacks put Russian fingers on the switch at power plants, U.S. says. That was the headline March 15th last year in the New York Times. Quote, the administration accused Russia this week of engineering a series of cyber attacks that targeted U.S. and European nuclear power plants and water and electric systems, and could have sabotaged or shut power plants off at will. That was March of last year. Within a few months, by last summer, July of last year, the threats and the description of the intrusions were getting more and more concrete. This is from the Wall Street Journal. Russian hackers reach U.S. utility control rooms, say Homeland Security officials. Hackers working for Russia claimed hundreds of victims last year in a giant and long-running campaign that put them inside the control rooms of U.S. electric utilities, where they could have caused blackouts, according to federal officials. Those officials say, quote, the campaign likely is continuing. That was as of last summer, July 2018. By this year, by January 2019, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence released its unclassified public-facing document, which it puts out every year, called the Worldwide Threat Assessment. The Worldwide Threat Assessment this year, January of this year, included this short public-facing warning that Russia's government wasn't just looking to, build this kind of capacity to shut the lights off here, or threatening to amass that kind of power inside our country. The warning from DNI as of January of this year is that Russia now has that power. This was the exact quote from the Worldwide Threat Assessment released by the DNI in January. Quote, Russia has the ability to execute cyber attacks in the United States that generate localized temporary disruptive effects on critical infrastructure, such as disrupting an electrical distribution network for at least a few hours. So that was the public warning as of January this year from the Director of National Intelligence. Russia, you've seen all these warnings coming. Russia now has the ability to turn off the lights in the United States if they want to. Right? That statement from the DNI in January, I mean, if you see it in context, that's the culmination of a few years of open source reporting and leaks of official government documents to reporters and increasingly urgent and specific warnings from Homeland Security and law enforcement and intelligence about Russia developing this capacity to target us in that way. Now, when you stack up all those reports over the past few years, given the crescendo of that public reporting and the piling up of that evidence and the increasing urgency of that story, even as it was just told by the U.S. government, starting, Christmas 2015 into 2016, 2017, 2018, and into this year, if you look at the increasing urgency and specificity of those warnings that we've had over the past few years, well, now, today, at the end of that long string of news stories and warnings, it probably should not have come as a surprise to get this report, that the U.S. is doing the same thing back, that the U.S. has developed the same capacity. Quote, U.S. escalates online attacks on Russia's power grid. And what David Sanger and Nicole Perlroth describe as a previously unreported deployment of American computer code inside Russia's grid, the New York Times is now citing multiple U.S. officials who are describing, quote, the placement of potentially crippling malware inside the Russian systems at a depth and with an aggressiveness that has never been tried before. It is intended, quote, partly as a warning and partly to be poised to conduct cyber strikes if a major conflict broke out between the U.S. and Moscow. This initiative has been carried out by U.S. Cyber Command, which is part of the U.S. military. And this is interesting. Recent changes to U.S. law, thanks both to a presidential directive and thanks to a little-noticed new legal authority that was slipped into the military authorization bill last year. Those new legal authorities allow these kinds of actions that are described in this Times piece. They allow these kinds of actions apparently to be carried out by Cyber Command on their own say-so, without having to get specific permission from the president to do it, and also without having to get specific permission from Congress. According to the Times, quote, so far there is no evidence that the U.S. has actually turned off the power inside Russia, just as the Russians have not turned off power inside the United States. But the placement of malicious code inside both systems revives the question of whether a nation's power grid or other critical infrastructure that keeps homes, factories, and hospitals running constitutes a legitimate target for online attack. So, there's a couple. First of all, I think this is important. I think that's a super interesting and sort of rattling question in terms of what capacity we have toward other countries and what capacity they have toward us that would absolutely target civilian infrastructure in a way that we might not previously understand as the way wars might be conducted. But there's a couple things that are weird about, well, I guess first I should say, I think it's not weird that the U.S. has developed this capacity, right? I mean, given how acutely focused we know the U.S. government has been on Russia developing this capacity over the last few years, this revelation that the U.S. has decided to develop the same capacity back at them, so we've got sort of mutually assured destruction here, it's sort of not that surprising. The revelation that the U.S. has developed this capacity is not what is weird here, even though that does sort of rattle me. The weird things here are two things about the way this story has broken, and both of them have to do with President Trump. The first really strange thing about the reaction to this New York Times reporting is President Trump's response to it online, because this story apparently sort of made him flip out. This is what he posted online in response. Do you believe that the failing New York Times just did a story stating that the U.S. is substantially increasing cyber attacks on Russia? This is a virtual act of treason by a once great paper so desperate for a story, any story, even if bad for our country. Bad for our country? Next tweet. Also not true. Wait, is it bad if it's not true? Also not true. Anything goes with our corrupt news media today. They will do or say whatever it takes with not even the slightest thought of consequence. These are true cowards and without doubt the enemy of the people. And I realize, president types thing, right? The president says thing. But why is the president so freaked out by this news article? I mean, first of all, if the Times is reporting something that isn't true, if the U.S. hasn't developed this capacity, then why would it be treason for the U.S. or for the New York Times to report that the U.S. has done this? It would be treason? Really? Betraying the... Also, why are you so flipped out about the potential consequence? They will do or say whatever it takes with not even the slightest thought of consequence. What do you think the consequence might be of Russia thinking that we have upped our cyber capacity against them? What's the scary consequence of that for you? I mean, the president is reacting to this like this is the worst thing in the world for the U.S. to be reported to have a new offensive capacity toward Russia. Why is that so scary to you that that's in the paper? It's a weird response from the president. What's he worried is going to happen now that that's public news? I mean, what do you think the consequence is going to be of Russia learning that we have done this? Why does that bother you so much? The other weird part about this story is that apparently the president might have freaked out about this news, in part because he might have first learned it from the New York Times. Cyber Command may have been doing this. They may have been developing this offensive capacity in Russia without ever telling him that is what they were doing. Quoting from the Times, quote, 2 administration officials said they believed Mr. Trump had not been briefed in any detail about the steps to place these implants, software code that can be used for surveillance or attack, inside the Russian grid. Pentagon and intelligence officials described broad hesitation to go into detail with Mr. Trump about operations against Russia for concern over his reaction and the possibility that he might countermand it or discuss it with foreign officials, as he did in 2017 when he mentioned a sensitive operation in Syria to the Russian foreign minister. So there's a lot going on in the world. What we have just learned from the New York Times is that the U.S. government has developed a new offensive capacity against Russia in the cyber field. The president is publicly freaking out that that has been publicly reporting. He's both denying that it's happening and saying it's terrible that it's being reported and we should worry about the consequences of this. Also, U.S. officials are willing to tell the New York Times that they do stuff, particularly when it comes to Russia, without telling the president about it all the time, because they think he might countermand those actions. He might tell them not to do it, or he might tell the Russians what we're doing in a way that would hurt the U.S. government's efforts and the U.S. military's efforts. So I think it's worth getting some expert help to understand what's going on here and the importance of this story and some of the other stories that I just talked about. But let me just tell you one thing about the person we've got here tonight on deck to help us understand some of this stuff. In June 2017, so the first summer that Trump was in office, June 1st, 2017, investigative reporter Michael Isikoff at Yahoo News reported this remarkable and still sort of largely unheralded, but really, really, really important story about what happened as soon as Trump got in office. And Isikoff broke this story June 1st. NBC News was able to confirm it later that same day. But what Isikoff first ferreted out that day was that in the very first few days of the Trump administration, top Trump administration officials were dispatched to the State Department to immediately tell State Department employees that Trump wanted to unilaterally drop U.S. sanctions against Russia. He wanted to get rid of U.S. sanctions on Russia on his own say-so alone. And so he dispatched top officials to the State Department in his first days in office to tell State Department staffers they needed to help put together whatever plans would be necessary for him to get that done, for him to unilaterally give Putin the thing he most wanted. Veteran State Department officials decided that this was alarming enough behavior that they sounded the alarm to other veteran and recently retired State Department officials, and they set in plan a motion to let Congress know this was happening, because these new Trump administration officials were trying to do it without telling anyone. Senior officials at the State Department, including Dan Fried, who was a top sanctions official, and Tom Malinowski, who had just stepped down as an assistant secretary of state, those senior officials and former officials did go ahead and tell Congress. They alerted Republican and Democratic members of Congress as to what the Trump administration was very quietly trying to do on the president's own say-so, with nobody knowing that they were doing it. And that ultimately led to this remarkable and underappreciated thing that happened just in the first few weeks, just in the first few months of the Trump administration, which is that based on those warnings from those national security professionals who were alerted to what Trump was trying to get away with secretly inside the State Department as soon as he got in office, thanks to those alerts, both houses of Congress, both the Senate and the House, in hugely overwhelming and bipartisan votes, passed legislation to affirm the sanctions on Russia and to block Trump from dropping them unilaterally without anybody else's say-so. I say it was an overwhelming vote. It was 98-2 in the Senate. It was 419-3 in the House. And Trump did not want to sign that law. He wanted to get rid of the sanctions on Russia, right? But with majorities that overwhelming, well over veto-proof majorities, right? He had no choice. And so he squawked and he said he didn't want to do it, and he issued a signing statement saying he disagreed with it, but he had to sign it. And that's how these sanctions on Russia got upheld, so Trump couldn't get rid of them himself. And that was the first reported instance we had of all sorts of people inside the U.S. government, Republicans and Democrats both, conservatives, liberals, career non-ideological, nonpartisan people, all of them coming together to the belief that this president could not be trusted to handle a national security matter like that on his own say-so. Not specifically when it comes to Russia. We now know that started the first few days he was in office. It's the whole reason there are still sanctions on Russia today. And now this week we learn that this far into the Trump administration, it's still happening. Pentagon and intelligence officials are willing to tell the New York Times now that they are literally not even telling him about new offensive capacities that Cyber Command have just developed to enable the U.S. military to shut off Russia's lights if we want to. They didn't tell Trump. They let him read about it in the Times, whereupon he freaked out. Can't be true. I mean, this idea of saving the country from the commander-in-chief, protecting national security interests from a president who is believed to pose a threat to them. I mean, that gets talked about a lot of the time as if it's like still an abstract or like a future risk question. It turns out we are living in that era right now. That is happening right now. And that is not supposed to be the way it goes. But how do we responsibly, as Americans under this Constitution, grapple with the fact that that's happening now? Former Assistant Secretary of State Tom Malinowski, who I mentioned was part of that effort at the State Department with that initial sanctions freakout right after Trump was sworn into office. Tom Malinowski is no longer at the State Department. He's no longer Assistant Secretary of State. He is now a Democratic member of Congress, who, among other things, sits on the Foreign Relations Committee. And Congressman Malinowski joins us live next. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.